What if I told you that who you vote for may not end up on the next ballot? It's seemingly the case here in 2024 as we head to the November general election, with candidates dropping out, assassination attempts on other candidates, and October surprises happening in July. So what do we make of it as we head into the fall rush? What should we expect out of this year's presidential election? There's no one better to talk about that than Dr. Chris Borick, who joins us today to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Life in politics moves fast, but in 2024, it seems to be moving a lot faster than most of us are even accustomed to. Things that we traditionally call October surprises are showing up in July, not unlike the pumpkin spice latte, and we're confused about where this election is headed. And when that happens, there's nobody better to interview than Dr. Chris Borick. He's a professor of political science at Muhlenberg College, where he also directs the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion. Dr. Borick, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Oh, Sam, thank you so much. It's what a pleasure to be back, and what time to be talking about politics.
Indeed. When we had you here at the start of the year, we were talking about whether or not the incumbents, President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump, would win their primaries. Was Dean Phillips really a challenge to Joe Biden? Was Nikki Haley a challenge to Donald Trump? And we kind of said then, no, look, this is going to be a Trump-Biden election. And I don't think either of us saw what we have today coming.
Yeah, that's fair. It seems like a lifetime ago, Sam, as you frame that. And yes, the race was established between these two known entities, firmly implanted in the minds of Pennsylvanians and voters all across the country, and it seemed to have that stability that we would think. You know, we did, I'm sure, talk like we often do. They're older gentlemen. You can't take anything for granted. Things could happen, right? We say stuff like that in interviews all the time. But ultimately, the trajectory seems set. And this summer, as you mentioned in your opening, has left us with a whole different landscape. It'll be one of those summers where you think back, where you're a professor, I'm a professor, and I talk historically about elections and things that happened and big events. And this summer will be hard to describe for those that want to think about what elections were like in the year 2024. Right.
I saw a tweet. Someone said, we are living through the hardest section on the 2050 AP government exam, or AP US history exam.
That's brilliant. Someone's going to have to put all these things down about what happened in the summer of 2024.
Exactly. Let's talk about the respective candidates and the parties as they head into this general election. Let's start with the Democrats. They are the incumbent party. President Joe Biden withdrawing from the election in July, withdrawing from this race. We haven't seen an incumbent president not run since Lyndon Johnson in 1968 chose to withdraw. Did you see this coming? I mean, I'm sure you did too. I took a lot of interviews about whether he was going to withdraw, and I insisted, look, if Gerald Ford didn't withdraw, if Jimmy Carter didn't withdraw, Joe Biden's not withdrawing. Did you see this coming?
You know, not until the end, Sam. I'd lie if I said I saw it coming early. In the beginning of the summer, certainly President Biden's liabilities were starting to show up in the polls. He was struggling. He was losing ground. Former President Trump was performing very well across swing states and across the country. And there was mounting voices and mounting pressures on the Democratic side to perhaps think about options, but it didn't seem to be manifesting in a real big movement. That all changed with the debate. That really was a seminal event in the whole landscape of presidential politics this year, where it started a cascading effect of that he wasn't there. And the polls started to show within Democrats, among the Democratic electorate, faith in Biden had really dissipated, and that led to the voices, all the people coming to talk to him about it. Then after the failed assassination attempt on former President Trump that really kind of rallied support around him, I think the belief among Democrats was no longer tenable, the election, and I think the pressure mounted. And I think, to his credit, President Biden saw it too and said, okay, for the best interest of the party, best interest of the country, I should step aside.
Vice President Harris, very quickly kind of coalesced those delegates in the DNC. How does that shift the dynamic of the party's ticket and of this race?
It's a weird scenario, Sam, where it changes lots of things and doesn't change other things much at all, right? So if you look at kind of the overall race, divided country, divided electorate, some of those things were in place before, some of those things are in place after. Internally, though, within kind of you look at it within the Democratic coalition and politics in Pennsylvania and beyond, Vice President Harris ascending to this position it gives and it takes in terms of the Democratic electorate. One thing it gives back is an area of the electorate that was really waning in the Democratic coalition. This was younger voters. This was voters of color that poll after poll had shown moving away from Biden, at least in the marginal way that would really undermine a Democrat's chance. They have to hold these groups with overwhelming majorities. And that was dissipating throughout the summer. The polls since, and again, we're still working with a few weeks of polls, so we're making sense of them all, do show that she's been able to reinvigorate that part of the electorate, give them some enthusiasm, bring a significant share of those that seem to be waning back in. The big question is, how will she hold with other segments of the Democratic electorate? A place like Pennsylvania, older, whiter, Catholic in a lot of parts of the state like the Northeast. Will she still be able to hold those groups that Biden, despite all his liabilities, still had some strengths within? And so I think she's, on the whole, probably brought in more than not, and the polls seem to support that. But it doesn't mean that she doesn't have weaknesses that have kind of altered other parts of the Democratic coalition.
Sure. Let's talk about Veepstakes. Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota is the choice. Yes. A lot of hype over Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. What does the Walz selection do for the ticket, and where do you rate that as opposed to had it been a Josh Shapiro?
Yeah, it was really fascinating kind of lead up to this decision to go with Governor Walz. Governor Shapiro, I think, would have offered enormous assets to the campaign. He's talented, as someone that follows Pennsylvania politics. I've watched him for 20 years, from his time in county government through state legislature, through Attorney General and governor. He is a talented, disciplined, focused campaigner. He would be a great asset, and he also is from the premier swing state of Pennsylvania.
Right.
So you could see why everyone was considering him, why he still might be a top-tier future Democratic presidential nominee. And so there was speculation that he had become the front runner in that. Ultimately, vice presidents, as you know, political scientists, have modest impacts on races. We vote for the top of the ticket. That doesn't mean they don't matter, but they're moderately impactful compared to the presidential candidates themselves. For Harris, I think what she looked at is the complementary nature of the office. The political science literature on this says that geography matters a little bit, all those things do, but it's really how good they are at kind of aligning with the top of the ticket and being a spokesperson and fulfilling that role. And I think she felt very comfortable with Governor Walz. I think he is, as we've seen in his unveiling, if you will, over recent days, someone that can speak in a way that attracts progressives. His record, especially since becoming governor, is quite progressive, quite left-leaning. That helps energize the left base. But his demeanor, his affect, his style, his identity, right? A football coach, a rural guy, gun owner, all the things that he is, make him someone that I think has reach into the more moderate areas that might transcend images of Harris within the Democratic Party.
Let me ask you this, and kind of pivoting to what they need to do to win. I mean, they are the incumbent party. One of the pros of a Josh Shapiro vice presidency is he is much more moderate. He's worked with Republicans, put them in his administration when he was Attorney General, when he was governor, or as governor. And one of two of the conversation points. One is would that have kind of helped on the margins with a more moderate choice? And then secondly, of course, the question of anti-Semitism. The Israel-Gaza situation is one that affects, it's an intra-party fight in the Democratic Party more so than in the Republican Party. There are anti-Semitic factions in the Republican Party, but you kind of see this really coming out in the Democratic Party more, that split. And there's a lot of conversation. Obviously, we heard all the voices pushing back on Shapiro being Jewish, on his actions on the protests across campuses in Pennsylvania. How much of a role do you think that played? Would he have helped with the moderates on the margins, but then hurt the base? How do we break that down?
It's a fascinating and important question that Harris had to evaluate, I think. And so, do I think he would have had some liabilities among progressives? Ultimately, I think yes, Sam. I think for some of the reasons we talked about, his positions primarily on Israel and the Gaza protests that we've seen in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. Also some other issues, right? He's bumped against Democratic base on things like school choice. People in the environmental community in the state aren't all that enamored with his policies on fracking and other things. So part of his appeal to the center is he's willing to break with his party.
Right.
And that's why our polls and others show 60% approval ratings for him, which is unbelievable in this day and age in a divided state, partisan-wise. And so I think he could have helped in Pennsylvania, certainly, which is important. Pennsylvania is a premier swing state. He has appealed to moderates. Could that have nudged up Harris's numbers a little bit? I think. If she had picked him, would progressives had balked at the end because of some of their dissatisfaction? I'm highly skeptical of that. I think because they care about issues like the environment, they care about issues about education, that they probably would say the choice between Trump and Harris is clear enough. That's my guess, which would have made him, I think, a really good candidate to pair with. The anti-Semitism part of it, I think, is a legitimate concern on how he was evaluated. Some of his statements about protesters and his rhetoric, I think, you might judge as a bit over the top and maybe not the best choice to describe some of the activities. But his policies on Israel, if you look at Josh Shapiro's kind of formal statements, I mean, Pennsylvania doesn't have an Israel policy, but Shapiro's policy, they don't look all that different than a lot of other Democrats of the administration. So I wonder, in some ways, was he judged as a very devout, practicing Jew in a different way than he might have been otherwise if he had taken some of those same positions?
Last question here. What does the Harris-Walz ticket need to do to shore up a win in November? Yeah,
I think, it'll be said over and over again how important turnout is and working on turnout and energizing. And part of their campaign right now has created energy that was nowhere near that in the Democratic Party. So in some ways realizing that, finding ways to get voters engaged on the margin that might have been kind of dissatisfied during Biden's run and making sure that they're in right now. It's appealing to some of those voters that, as I mentioned before, some of those older voters that might have still felt comfortable with Joe Biden, didn't like Donald Trump all that much, but are swingish to stay with the Democrats, even with her on the ticket. That's going to take a lot of organization, a lot of work in Pennsylvania. I think this is one of the less discussed part of the campaign. Maybe it will be this fall, how important that will be.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that breakdown. When we come back, I want to talk about the Republican side. A lot more to cover. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Dr. Borick, thanks again for joining us. Let's pivot from the Democrat ticket to the Republican ticket. No switch at the top of the ticket there. But as everybody who's watching this knows, in July, there was an assassination attempt on former President Trump when he was in Butler, Pennsylvania. This is something that has been largely condemned, widely condemned. President Biden went on air about it. Governor Shapiro addressed it. But the question, and we could talk about that and condemn that just on its face value, right? I mean, that was a terrible, terrible thing that occurred. But electorally, does something like that shift the dynamics of the race?
Yeah, it very well could, and by itself, kind of in just piecing it, the tragic events that took place out in Butler with loss of life and former President Trump being injured, I think could be in any year a transformative event, right? A rallying cry, a rallying around the individual, in this case, former President Trump. And to a degree, you saw that, right? Right after the events, his polling numbers, I think, peaked. They had been rising throughout the summer. People's views of him became more positive on a whole. Former President Trump is one of the most divisive figures in American political history, right? With people very polarized on him with love, hate. So it's hard for him to move the dial in terms of changing attitudes. He's been around so long. People have very deep, sunken views on him. Even with that said, after those tragic events in Butler, his numbers did modestly increase. But of course, intervening effects this summer, as we talked about, soon after that, President Biden decided to step aside, which kind of took some of the attention off something as historic and tragic as what happened there, and kind of moved the attention to other places. Right. And I think in many ways, President Biden's timing is President Biden's timing. It's a personal choice for him. But it couldn't have been better from a Democratic perspective in some ways to really refocus people's attention to the Democrats at a time when so much attention was towards President Trump and Republicans in the wake of that tragic affair.
And the convention that came around the heels of that as well. Let's talk Veepstakes again. For very obvious reasons that our viewers would know, former President Trump did not pick his former vice president to be his running mate, nor has former Vice President Pence endorsed President Trump. It's been very clear that he's not going to do that. There was a lot of discussion, like with the Democrat VP pick, of does he kind of go into that base, that MAGA populist Republican base, with someone like a J.D. Vance? Does he try to maybe speak to conservatives and even moderate voices with someone like Governor Burgum? Or is this a conservative move with Senator Rubio, Senator Scott? And he goes with J.D. Vance. What does this do to the dynamics of the party? What does it do to the dynamics of the race?
Yeah, it's such an interesting pick, and you juxtapose it against 2016, right, when he picked Mike Pence as his running mate, which was seen as an ultimate nod to the more traditional conservative. Certainly, Mike Pence was not anybody's rhino, right? But he was fully kind of situated within the conservative establishment, if you will, that had emerged in this century, and so that was a nod, right? Hey, I'm a little bit different. I'm going to bring on Pence to do that. This time around, as you alluded to, his choice of Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. It was very much a divergence from that decision, picking someone that has evolved in his own way, Senator Vance, both on Trump and on politics, but in the last few years has been a vociferous voice for the MAGA ascending populist vision of the party, right, and a full-throated defender of Trump. And in this case, Trump, I think, feeling that in the position of party that he's molded the party in his own image, that make it a full-blown MAGA ticket, if you will, is something that he's comfortable with. And it kind of shows that his presence in the party, he thinks that he is, in some ways, the party, and could do this. And then there was always the thought, well, who's to come? It's a successor. I don't think, Donald Trump speaks for Donald Trump. I don't think his interest in the long term is the success of the Republican Party. He's kind of alluded to that in his own way over time. But certainly he's picked someone that has a vision espoused recently that is his vision for the party.
Just like the Democrats have these issues that divide them within the party, Israel, Gaza, another one is the environmental versus the labor union, jobs made in America side. The Republicans have their issues as well. And one of the things, the more hidden stories that came out this last RNC is the move on social issues. The party no longer supports federal legislation on abortion to limit it, to ban it, anything like that. No longer are opposed to same-sex marriage. Even ESGs, which gets a little bit inside baseball with investments, but a lot of religious organizations using investment funds that don't support, are supported by gambling and so forth, now put out. A shift away from that traditional conservatism that we've seen with people like Mike Pence, Rick Santorum, Pat Toomey. The policy isn't made as big of an issue in the electoral campaign. What do we make of this? Is it something that you think would affect the election? Or is it one of those things where you have people, maybe both parties, that might just end up kind of politically homeless here?
Yeah, it's a really interesting aspect and completely overlooked, Sam, which is great that you brought it up. You know, the party, as you said, you know, the platform on these positions really does reflect their candidate right now in Donald Trump, who, you know, historically hasn't been wedded to really deep kind of conservative, religiously oriented positions. It hasn't been a deep interest. He's of course adopted positions that I think for his interest as a candidate and to win support within the Republican Party may align. But ultimately, I don't think he's someone that is deeply devoted to those issues. And so he thinks to move to the center, if you will, on the issues that you looked at is in his best political interest and would like that on the record, right? This is why you see him fighting back against like things like Project 2025, right? That he's one, hey, that's not me, right? Because he knows it's probably a political liability. And he thinks questions like reproductive rights and others right now, the party's position would be something that would be thrown back at him. But important, as you note, and I've read in a number of pieces on this, there are people within the party, right, that are deeply religious, deeply have deep-felt beliefs that are very much worried about this move away, right, and that it's somehow a trade-off. They've already, in some ways, I believe, made a trade-off to adopt Donald Trump as the figurehead for the party and accept some of perhaps the things they dislike about him. Is this now getting a little too far for them? And will they show up? The alternative might be on the Democratic side, still too much to consider, but will they be engaged? And even a modest, downturn in terms of turnout among that group could be impactful.
Yeah. Last question, same as we asked with the Harris-Walz ticket. What does the Trump-Vance ticket need to do if they want to reclaim that White House?
Yeah, it's so fascinating to watch the campaign the last few weeks, and I think President Trump has struggled in some ways to adapt to the new reality, and there is a new reality, right? He's even hearkening that Biden might come back type of things. He's not coming back, and so how do you adjust for this? And I think the party, if you look at messaging, for example, where they want to go with Harris. And make her seem ultimately unacceptable as being too far left, too progressive for that. And she's had statements and opened herself up for that. And you could see this in ads, like the Trump ads and others, really targeting her as being too left, too weak, too dangerous, right? Words that I'll see in these ads. I think that messaging, if you're consistent with, could be pretty potent. The challenge, I think, for the Trump campaign is to keep the former president himself on message. Over this time frame, he's kind of diverged into identity politics and following a path that might have worked some ways for him in 2016 and others, but doesn't necessarily align with the strategies that the party is headed on this time. And so I can imagine more, you're a political strategist, Sam, some strategists working for the former president who are a bit uneasy with their candidate in terms of how he's messaging compared to their messages.
Sure. Again, Dr. Borick, thank you so much for joining us for that breakdown. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Dr. Borick, thank you for joining us, for breaking this down. I mean, life and politics move fast. And I'm sure by the time this airs, there'll be something we'll be texting about, oh, hey, we got to get you back on to talk about this change.
Ready to go.
I want to move away from the present to some extent as we close out and ask you to kind of set this year's election, everything we've seen in the context of history, of electoral history in the United States. A lot of parallels, obviously, to 1968. the last time we saw a sitting president withdraw from a race, a sitting vice president becoming the nominee, a assassination attempt, unfortunately a successful one in that race, a former or failed presidential candidate in Richard Nixon back then running again, and a Robert F. Kennedy in the race. Now, half of those parallels were Robert F. Kennedy in '68, but a lot is made about those parallels. But this is an unprecedented election year, and we say that it seems like every 4 years right now, but truly something that we haven't seen in a long, long time. We've seen close races, and we've seen elections go to the Supreme Court. But where do you place, or how do you set this election so far in the context of history?
Yeah, you set it up so nicely to kind of compare it, right? And we do. We're captured by the moment, Sam. We always think, well, this is the most controversial, this is the most important, right? We're prisoners to the moment. But I'll kind of step out from the details that you shared so nicely about 1968. It was a time in the country in '68 where we were divided. The tensions, people have written books about coming apart as a country in that particular year. And I think those same broad tensions are part of American life in 2024. We feel like in many ways we're drifting apart. We're becoming segmented. We're becoming more sorted. And that enters into our politics. And it leaves us with those comparisons, as you said. So how does '68 end is a fascinating question. Richard Nixon wins over Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president, who ascended to a convention. He largely didn't run in the primaries, just like Vice President Harris did this time. So very similar there. It's in Chicago, by the way.
Right.
Just to add one more similarity for it, and we'll see how if there's protest and other things like there were. '68's famous for the protest in Chicago, but it was a very, very close race. '68 was. Richard Nixon won an incredibly narrow victory over Vice President Hubert Humphrey in that election. So the divided country, a divided election, which led, eventually, as we get into the late '60s, as the '60s wind down, and with the tensions as part of American life, law and order was a big issue, right? And then Nixon was going to bring order to a country that was worried about order and civil unrest, and of course, former President Trump's part of his messaging, right? That he could do this, he could bring those things. So ultimately, we're a country in 2024 historically that why we would make connections to '68, besides the obvious comparisons that you framed for us, is a country that's divisions have become quite apparent and are now woven deeply into the political process. We'll see, as American history could show often, those tend to transform into a new period after. And so I'm not going to speculate what comes after 2024. We have enough to speculate there, Sam. But historically, it's a time that I think we see the divisions play a primary role in defining where we're at.
I guess history will be the ultimate judge on where that goes.
We get if I'm lucky enough to stay alive for a while, I hope to see it.
Well, Dr. Borick, thank you again for joining us, for your expertise, and I'm sure we'll be talking more as we head into the fall election.
Sam, it's a pleasure. It's always great to hear your perspectives, which are wonderful.
Pleasure is all ours. My thanks to Dr. Chris Borick for joining us tonight. Of course, my thanks to each of you for tuning in as well. Hope to see you again right back here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.